Hello and welcome back to another update. It is your host Weep Union, and we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. In this one there is significant developments, so let's start out here to the west of Bakhmut, east of Chasiv Yar. Following the Russian capture of the entirety of the fortifications in the southern flank of Chasiv Yar, the Russians are now moving through the eastern parts of Chasiv Yar. In this attempt, they managed to gain a foothold in the easternmost buildings of the eastern parts of Chasiv Yar. With this, they have a foothold within the school area of the eastern parts of Chasiv Yar, and they have managed to capture the fortifications in the area. This all allows them to hold on to this foothold, and they'll likely attempt to push further in a southern direction to expand their zone of control on the outskirts and gain control over the fortifications in the southern parts. At the same time, they are looking to gain control over the school area, as schools are heavily fortified buildings in normal day-to-day basis. That is why during earthquakes or natural disasters, or even during bomb raids, it is recommended to take shelter in a school, besides the fact that they aren't military targets usually. The main fighting taking place in this section of the front line would be over the high buildings, the apartment complexes here in the southern parts of the easternmost part of Chasiv Yar. If the Russians manage to gain control over those, then they would de facto have control over the whole eastern section of Chasiv Yar, and the fighting will move directly towards the forest patches in the northern and southern flanks for a breakthrough across the canal. Moving on to the next section of the front line, we see here to the northwest of Avdiivka, in the direction of Novobakhmutivka, the Russians have managed to gain full control over the Dacha area east of Novobakhmutivka and move through to capture the forest line here to the east of Novobakhmutivka. This has also allowed the Russians to completely cut off the area between Berdishi and the fortifications located in between Novobakhmutivka and Berdishi, with the cut off from the south with the Russian control over the village, and from the north with the control over the forest line. All of these fortifications in between are now left without supplies, and the Ukrainians would be forced to pull back to some of the former fortifications in the back line to avoid being cut off here in the central parts. So they'll have to move through the fields and out of sight of the roads. Other than that, they could attempt to break through the recent Russian advances by coordinating an attack between Novobakhmutivka and the fortifications to the south. Other than that, we see that throughout the area there's no roads, which means that the resupply going through to these fortifications as well are beyond the roads connected to them. Without these connections, all of these fortifications are left without supply, without going through the fields, and that the Russians have plenty of artillery to go around for. But with this development and advance by the Russians, the Battle of Ochiritsine can begin, with the fighting reaching Novobakhmutivka at the very borders of the village and in the northern direction towards the fortifications outside of Ochiritsine. The Russians have now reached the outskirts of these two villages. Combine that with the fighting by Novokalinove, the capture of Berdishi and the majority of Semenivka, the Russians are now in a position where the fighting is reaching the heights and the heavily fortified areas of Ukraine's third line of defense. And with this, the fighting here northwest of Avdiivka enters a new stage. Moving on to the next section of the front line, we see here in the direction of Krasnohorivka, the Russians have expanded their foothold in the southern parts of the city, and they've managed to capture the fortifications in the area and broken through the Ukrainian defenses in the south. With this, it is likely that the Russians will gain full control over southern parts of Krasnohorivka, which will allow them to gain a proper foothold, have multiple supply lines to resupply their forces within the city, and this has now allowed the Russians to start fighting over the central fortifications of Krasnohorivka, which spells towards the mid-game of the siege of Krasnohorivka. The Russians, if they manage to capture this fortification in central Krasnohorivka, it will only be a matter of time before the city falls. The reason for that is that the Russians now, with the vast use of the FAB bombs, has allowed the Russians to heavily bombard any of the Ukrainian positions within the city. So as long as the Russians have a foothold, they're able to push through the front by using these FAB bombs. This will subsequently force the Ukrainians to either withdraw or be bombed. which will end up putting it in a repeat of Avdiivka situation, where the Ukrainians simply ended up withdrawing completely from the city due to the heavy bombing of the FAB bombs. The Russians are now focusing on two cities across the front, Krasnohorivka and Chasiv. Both of these are being heavily bombarded by the FAB bombs, and in the Krasnohorivka directions, the vast majority of the fortifications are in the eastern parts of the city, both in the east and to the northeast. The Russians have now completely bypassed all of those fortifications by getting a foothold from the south, and with this, the Russians are focusing on the final line of fortifications within the city before moving on to the industrial area in the center that will allow the Russians to take full control of the city. What this means to the front line is that the Russians will have control over all of the main areas, the Marinka, Krasnohorivka, Nevelske, and Pervomaiske, west of Donetsk. And this will be the final city west of Donetsk that the Russians have to take before they can start developing their offensive operations. There was a list of cities and villages west of or in the Donetsk region itself that were necessary before the Russians launched the massive offensive to take control over Donetsk region. That was Volodar to the south, Marinka, Krasnohorivka, and Pervomaiske to the west of Donetsk, Avdiivka to the north of the city, Bakhmut and Chasiv here to the northwest, and Liman in the west of Kreminna. So far, the Russians have managed to capture Bakhmut, Avdiivka, and Marinka. Fighting is now taking place by Krasnohorivka and Chasiv. This leaves the only sole area as Volodar and Liman in the northern and southern flanks, but this could in and of itself be a part of the larger offensive. With the capture of Marinka and what I expect soon to be Krasnohorivka, Avdiivka, Bakhmut, and soon Chasiv, the Russians have captured enough to allow them to significantly develop the supply lines here in the Donetsk region, and then allow the Russians to launch a large-scale offensive due to the availability of supplies in the area. Moving further south in the direction of Novomikhailivka, there is this small advance by the Russians in the northern flank of the town, where they've managed to capture this forest line. With this, the Russians will likely continue to advance along the road towards Pereskovivka from the north. With the fighting continuing in Novomikhailivka, there is a slow advance by the Russians as the Ukrainians are putting up a tough fight, trying to recapture positions by the fortifications, however, so far with no success. Moving on to the next section of the front line, we see here by Uroshaine and Saramayolske, the Russians have restarted offensive operations in the direction of both of these villages, both to the south of Uroshaine and west of Saramayolske. However, so far it's only positional fighting. There's been no advances by the Russians. This leads to the fact that the Ukrainians are able to hold on to these villages and are protecting them, while the Russians are trying to poke around, do some probing attacks, and possibly push through with the tip of their forces. The Russian advances over the past half a month, the past 2 weeks, has been throughout the front line in these areas as we see on the map, mainly around Chasiv, northwest of Avdiivka, west of Donetsk towards Krasnohorivka, and by Novomikhailivka. As was mentioned in my analysis post the Battle of Avdiivka, with the fall of Avdiivka, the front line of the Ukrainians would be much more difficult to defend despite the fortifications. The main reason for that is a city is much easier to defend than open fields, even if those open fields contain a lot of fortifications, trenches, etc. Since the Russians captured Avdiivka, the Russians have managed to gain control of much more territory than what they were fighting over during the Battle of Avdiivka. This whole area between the north of Vodiane, here to the southern flank of Avdiivka, and up the way north to Novobakhmutivka, we've seen that the Russians have captured this whole area, which corresponds to the area the Russians were fighting over by Avdiivka. Even though the Ukrainians launched constant counterattacks and they were launching their Abrams tanks, they were using everything they had to prevent a Russian advance or even recapture territories, the Russians managed to advance past that and have broken through these Ukrainian attempts, and now are fighting over Netailove, Yestrobodivka, Umanske, Semenivka, Novobakhmutivka, Ozheretine, and Novokalinove, rather than the villages right west of Avdiivka. It is likely that as soon as the Russians push through that as well and reach the third line of defense, break through that, and if the Russians then launch attacks in other areas like west of Bakhmut, west of Chasiv Yar, the front line will gradually increase in speed. Currently, we're seeing a very slow advance by the Russians, and the Ukrainians are struggling even more to launch counterattacks. But at some point, the front line will break, and that will be because of the lack of fortifications, the lack of manpower, the lack of weaponry. Whichever the case, that breaks the Ukrainian army first. But at some point, it will break, and that is what I am pointing towards with my analysis, and that is simply that the Ukrainians are being pressured too much, the Russian army is growing too much, and the Ukrainian army is growing too slowly. This ends up in a position where the Ukrainian army is simply outmatched on the battlefield and will eventually lead to a collapse, because the current way the Ukrainians are coping with the Russian advances and increase in strength is that they simply put their reserves on the front line to hold out as long as possible. But that is just buying time, it's not winning a war. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. And have a great day.